Shabbat Shalom. In the earliest recorded Divrei Torah that we have, the practice of the rabbis was to start their sermons with a verse from the books of the prophets or the books of the writings, one of the non-Torah books in the Hebrew Bible. And eventually they would tie that quote from that verse back to this week's Torah portion. So that's the model I'm going to use today. I'd like to start by discussing one of my favorite lines from the book of Psalms in Psalm 16. And that line is, Shiviti Adonai Lenagdi Tamid. I place God in front of me always. Not in front as in prioritization, but in front as literally ahead of me, before me, opposite me, meaning top of mind. This is one of the verses that's frequently inscribed on the ceilings of synagogues, and it's been the case for hundreds of years, which makes sense if you're looking for inspiration while praying to put yourself in the right frame of mind to create a connection with the divine. This verse makes sense as a sort of mantra. Shiviti Adonai Lenagdi Tamid. I place God in front of me always. There's a story I like about a young yeshiva student in 19th century Poland who used to study with the great Rabbi Chaim Halberstam of the city of Sanz. And this yeshiva student would travel several days from his hometown to go to and from Sanz. And on the way there and back, he would pass through this other small town where he would stay for Shabbat. And this small town rabbi also had a few students and fancied himself to be on the level of the great Sanzer Rebbe. So the small town rabbi said to the student, I can teach you, and I'm closer to your hometown, so why are you traveling all this distance going back and forth to Sanz? And the student said with a smile, you're right, you are closer, but in Sanz, they're not only teaching me Torah and Talmud, they're also teaching me how to read minds. And the local rabbi said, oh yeah? If you can read minds, then what am I thinking of right now? And the student said, you're thinking, Shiviti Adonai Lenagdi Tamid. And the rabbi said, aha, that's not what I was thinking about at all. And the student said, no, so that's why I go to Sanz. So what does that really mean, to place God in front of you always? And if this is such an important concept, then how do we put it in action in our own life? One example that we can learn from is in this week's Parsha, which begins the month-long cycle of the saga of Joseph and his siblings. Today we read how Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, indentured as the servant of the Egyptian official Potiphar and his wife. And it says in the verses, actually I think the second and third verse that we read today, God was with Joseph, and his master saw that God was with him, with Joseph. So why does the Torah need to say God was with Joseph? Because we believe God is everywhere, so it's obvious God would be with Joseph. So why do we need to say so explicitly? And why does it need to both say that God was with Joseph and that Potiphar knew that God was with Joseph? In the classical Midrash collection known as Midrash Tanchuma, it explains it in the following way. The name of the Holy One of Blessing never left Joseph's lips. When Joseph entered to serve Potiphar, Joseph would whisper constantly to himself, Master of the universe, you are the one in whom I trust. You are the one who's my protector. May I find grace, kindness, and mercy in your sight and in the sight of all who see me, in the eyes of my master Potiphar. Thereupon Potiphar asked him, what are you whispering about? Perhaps you're trying to cast a spell over me. And Joseph said, no, I am praying that I may find favor in your sight. And hence it is written, and his master Potiphar saw that God was with him. So when it says God was with Joseph, the active party here is actually Joseph more than God, because Joseph was actively choosing to put God in his mind and in his speech. And by the way, you see this phrase repeated 3 more times in chapter 39, God was with Joseph. As Joseph's circumstances get more complicated and difficult, the phrase God was with Joseph is repeated again and again, showing that even in slavery and imprisonment, or perhaps especially in slavery and imprisonment, Joseph constantly had God on his lips and on his mind. It's almost like Joseph could have been saying, Shiviti Adonai Lenagdi Tamid. I place God in front of me always. I think this reaction complicates the meaning of that classic idea or classic phrase that there are no atheists in foxholes. That in times of war and difficulty and danger, people turn to prayer and spirituality when they might not otherwise. But I don't think that saying is true. Because, first of all, we know for a fact there are atheists in the military. And in fact, being a combatant in war or a victim of war and being exposed to the horrors that human beings can do to each other might actually, for some people, make you more likely to be an atheist. And I think if we're being honest, when we think about stories of survivors of the show, we know there are people who, after the war ended, maintained and returned to Jewish practice and beliefs and identification with the Jewish community. But there also were other people who denounced belief in what they saw as a silent or non-existent God. And it's certainly not for me to say that their reactions were wrong. What I think the saying should be is that God is in the foxhole, even with the atheists. It's the choice of the individuals in those situations to decide whether or not to let God in. If they do, if they say that they're choosing to place God in front of them and making a decision to place God in front of them, then they could say, like Joseph, that they believe that God is with them. And I know it sounds like a kind of an obvious statement. If you think about God, then God will be with you, especially because God will be with you even if you're not thinking about God. But what's really going on here is a choice of mindset, an active choice that people have to make. In times of difficulty, people decide between closing up in a self-protection mode or opening up to something bigger than oneself. And while that something bigger certainly can be God, I don't think it has to be. We can also learn from the example of another famous Jewish prisoner, Natan Sharansky, the refusenik who spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag, half of them in solitary confinement, for the crime of teaching Hebrew and wanting to make Aliyah and immigrate to Israel. In March 2020, as the world went into lockdown, Sharansky made a YouTube video in which he gave advice based on his own experience for how people could cope with the quarantine's restrictions on their movement and activities. And Sharansky's top tip was this: feel your connection. Remember that you are not alone. We Jews for thousands of years all over the world were scattered, but we always had this feeling that we were part of a big people, a great people, with our mutual past, with our mutual mission. Even during COVID, which was not an inherently Jewish challenge, of course it affected the Jewish community as it affected everybody, it wasn't a specifically Jewish challenge. And all the more so when refuseniks were being persecuted for their Jewish identities, what Sharansky is saying is that the Jewish response to difficult circumstances, secular or religious, the response to difficult circumstances is to remember our mission. And so what is the Jewish mission? Now, one classic answer to this question comes from another interpretation from the same midrash about Joseph constantly whispering when serving in Potiphar's house. And this midrash from 16th century Polish work Matnot Kahuna says that what Joseph was constantly whispering about was all of the Torah that he had learned from his father Jacob, in order that he not forget it while he was trapped in Egypt. Now, how exactly Joseph learned Torah hundreds of years before Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai is a question that Matnot Kahuna doesn't answer. But leaving aside the anachronism, the lesson is clear that Joseph stayed strong spiritually and emotionally during his years in captivity because he put his Jewish identity in front of him always. He was constantly talking about it, even if only to himself. He was reminding himself of the Jewish principles that can guide us to make our lives more meaningful and the world more whole. And therefore, when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him into engaging in adultery, even though Joseph might have wavered for a moment, eventually he made the ethical choice, even though he knew it would lead to dangerous consequences for him. To act like Joseph, therefore, is not only to make the choice to see God in front of you, but also to make the choice to act in a particularly Jewish way. Not just to do the right thing because it's the right thing, but to do the right thing because it's the Jewish thing. It's true that pretty much every culture has ethical codes that demand that their members do similar actions that the mitzvot command of us: telling the truth, being fair, taking care of others. And these morals are basically universal, but the way that we as Jews frame them is different. As it says in the Talmud, the way to follow God, and by the way, if we think about it visually, if you're following God, it implies that literally God is in front of us. We're putting God in front of us. Shiviti Adonai v'nagdi tamid. The way to follow God is to do our best to follow God's attributes. Just as God visits the sick, so too should we visit the sick. Just as God consoles mourners, so too should we console mourners. And as we said this morning in Birkot HaShachar, that God releases prisoners. If so, then so too should we work to release prisoners. The prisoners and hostages in Gaza, as well as anyone like Joseph who is trapped in unsafe or exploitative conditions. And not only that, but as Sharansky points out, having these holy and ethical missions and trying to make them into a reality can also give us purpose and meaning when we feel trapped or out of control in our own lives. By placing God in front of us, by choosing to let God into our lives in difficult circumstances, and by remembering God's mission for us as individuals and as members of the Jewish community, it won't solve all of our problems, and it certainly won't give us the ability of the student from Sans to read minds. But in moments when we feel trapped like Joseph, it can, in a very real way, set us free. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to supportpas.org or by making a donation. Shalom and see you in Shul.